My uncle texted me saying, "Thanks for the $500,000 business loan. The investment property closes next week." I stared at my phone in confusion and replied, "What loan?" Then he sent me a photo of loan documents with my forged signature, bank statements I'd never seen, and a business plan for a resort development I knew nothing about. That's when I realized someone had stolen my identity to commit massive fraud. And my own family was involved. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Maya Chun and I am 34 years old. I work as a senior data analyst for a healthcare technology company based in Denver, Colorado. I have spent the last 8 years building my career in this field, starting as a junior analyst fresh out of graduate school, and working my way up through dedication, long hours, and consistently excellent performance. My work involves analyzing patient outcomes data, identifying trends in treatment effectiveness, and helping hospitals optimize their care protocols. It is detailed, demanding work that requires both technical expertise and the ability to communicate complex findings to non-technical stakeholders. I earn a comfortable salary that reflects my experience and specialized skills, approximately $130,000 annually before taxes. I live alone in a modest 2-bedroom condominium in the Capitol Hill neighborhood. I purchased this condo 3 years ago, proud to become a homeowner in a competitive real estate market. The second bedroom serves as my home office, outfitted with the dual monitor setup and ergonomic furniture that allows me to occasionally work from home when I need focus time for complex analysis projects. The condo is nothing extravagant, but it represents something important to me. It is mine, purchased with money I earned through my own efforts, a tangible symbol of the financial stability I have worked hard to achieve. My family situation is complicated in ways that I have spent years trying to navigate with varying degrees of success. My parents divorced when I was 12 years old. My mother remarried within 2 years to a man I never particularly warmed to, and they moved to Arizona when I was in college. We maintain cordial but distant contact, exchanging messages on holidays and birthdays, but rarely engaging in substantive conversation. My father remarried as well, to a woman with 3 children from her previous marriage. Between managing his blended family and his demanding career as a commercial real estate attorney, he has had limited time and attention for me. I learned early to be self-sufficient, to solve my own problems, and to not expect much in the way of parental guidance or support. My extended family on my father's side has always been more present in my life than my immediate family. My paternal grandmother, whom I called Nai Nai, was the matriarch who held everyone together. She emigrated from Taiwan in the 1960s, worked multiple jobs to put my grandfather through engineering school, and raised 4 children while maintaining the cultural traditions that connected us to our heritage. She passed away 2 years ago at the age of 87, and her death left a void in our family structure that no one else has been able to fill. My father is the youngest of those 4 children. His older siblings include my Uncle James, who is 52 years old, and 2 aunts who live on the East Coast and whom I see rarely. Uncle James has always been the most entrepreneurial member of the family. While my father chose the stability of corporate law and my aunts pursued careers in medicine and academia, Uncle James has moved from one business venture to another for his entire adult life. Some of these ventures have been moderately successful. Others have failed spectacularly. He has owned a restaurant that went bankrupt within 2 years, started an import-export business that collapsed when his partner embezzled funds, and invested in various real estate projects with mixed results. Despite this inconsistent track record, Uncle James has always presented himself as a successful businessman on the verge of his big breakthrough. He drives expensive cars, though I suspect they are leased rather than owned. He wears designer suits and luxury watches. He name-drops connections to wealthy investors and influential business figures. At family gatherings, he dominates conversations with stories about deals he is negotiating, properties he is considering, and opportunities that are going to make him wealthy. My aunts roll their eyes at these performances, having heard similar stories for decades. My father listens with thinly veiled skepticism born from having lent James money in the past that was never fully repaid. I have always had a more complicated relationship with Uncle James. When I was younger, I found his confidence and ambition inspiring. He seemed so different from my father, who worked long hours at a job he found intellectually stimulating but emotionally draining. Uncle James talked about building empires, creating legacies, and achieving financial freedom. He paid attention to me in ways my busy, distracted father often did not. He asked about my interests, my goals, my ambitions. He told me I was smart and capable, and that I should dream bigger than a conventional career path. When I was in high school, Uncle James hired me to help with administrative work for one of his business ventures. I answered phones, filed documents, and organized his chaotic record-keeping system. He paid me generously for a teenage employee, and he treated me like a valued team member rather than just the boss's niece doing menial tasks. When I expressed interest in business and data analysis as potential career paths, he encouraged me enthusiastically. He told me that analytical skills would be invaluable in the modern economy, and that I should pursue that path seriously. During my college years, Uncle James stayed in touch more consistently than my own parents did. He sent occasional text messages asking how my classes were going. He took me out to dinner when he was in town for business. He gave me a generous check as a graduation gift when I completed my undergraduate degree. When I decided to pursue a master's degree in data analytics, he told me it was a smart investment in my future, and that the temporary financial strain would pay off exponentially in increased earning potential over my career. After I started my professional career and began earning a real salary, Uncle James occasionally asked me for small favors. Could I look at a spreadsheet for one of his projects and tell him if the numbers made sense? Could I review a business proposal and give him my analytical perspective? Could I explain some technical concept related to data management that he was encountering in his ventures? I was always happy to help. These requests made me feel valued for my expertise, and I appreciated that someone in my family recognized and respected my professional skills. About 5 years ago, Uncle James approached me with what he described as an investment opportunity. He was purchasing a small commercial property, a strip mall in a growing suburb, and he was offering family members the chance to invest in the project. He showed me financial projections indicating strong returns. He explained that having family members as co-investors would give him better terms from the bank and would allow us all to benefit from the property's appreciation. He suggested I invest $20,000. I was 29 years old at the time, 3 years into my career, and I had managed to save about $35,000. Investing more than half my savings into a single project felt risky, but Uncle James was persuasive. He emphasized that real estate was one of the most reliable wealth-building vehicles available, that the property was in an excellent location with strong demographic trends, and that my investment would grow substantially over time. He also emphasized the family aspect. This was a way for us to build wealth together, to support each other, to create something that would benefit the whole family for generations. I agreed to invest $15,000, a compromise between his request and my comfort level. He had me sign some paperwork, I transferred the money to an account he specified, and he assured me that I would receive quarterly updates on the property's performance and my share of any profits. Those quarterly updates arrived for about a year, showing modest but positive returns. Then they stopped coming. When I asked Uncle James about this, he explained that the property management company had changed, and there were some administrative delays in getting the updated reporting system established. He assured me everything was fine and that the updates would resume soon. They never did. Over the following months, I periodically asked Uncle James about the investment. He always had explanations. The property had some unexpected maintenance issues that absorbed the profits temporarily. The commercial real estate market was going through a temporary soft period. One of the major tenants had left, and it was taking time to find a replacement. His responses were always detailed enough to sound plausible but vague enough that I could not verify any specifics. Eventually I stopped asking. I wrote off the $15,000 mentally as a loss, an expensive lesson about mixing family and business, and I resolved to be more cautious in the future. Despite this disappointing experience, I maintained my relationship with Uncle James. He was still family, still someone who had been kind to me during my younger years, still someone who at least showed interest in my life and career. My expectations were now calibrated differently, but I did not cut him off entirely. We continued to see each other at family gatherings. We exchanged messages occasionally. The relationship continued, just with the understanding that I would not be making any more financial investments in his projects. 3 months ago, Nai's estate finally completed the probate process. She had left modest inheritances to each of her grandchildren, about $25,000 each. The money arrived in my account as a check from the estate attorney, and it felt bittersweet. I would have preferred to have my grandmother still alive rather than having this money. But since she was gone, I was grateful for her generosity and her desire to help her grandchildren even after her death. I deposited the check and decided to use the money to make extra payments on my mortgage, accelerating the payoff timeline and saving substantial interest over the life of the loan. Last Tuesday evening, I was working late at my dining room table, finishing up a complex analysis for a presentation scheduled for the following morning. My laptop was open with multiple spreadsheets and data visualizations in progress. I had a half-eaten takeout container of Thai food pushed to one side. My phone was face down on the table, set to do not disturb mode so I could focus without interruption. I was in the concentrated mental state that my work requires, tracking multiple variables and looking for patterns in patient readmission data. Around 8:30 in the evening, I took a break to stretch and check my phone. I had several messages waiting. Most were routine messages from coworkers about tomorrow's meeting, a notification from my bank about a bill payment, a promotional email from a retailer. Then I saw a text message from Uncle James, sent about an hour earlier. The message read, "Maya, thank you so much for the business loan. The investment property closes next week, and this is going to be the big one that changes everything for our family. Your support means the world to me. I promise you are going to see amazing returns on this. The resort development is going to be incredible." I read the message 3 times, my confusion growing with each reading. Business loan? Investment property? Resort development? I had no idea what he was talking about. I had not loaned Uncle James any money. I had not even spoken to him in over a month, since a brief conversation at a family gathering where we had exchanged pleasantries and he had mentioned something vague about a new project he was excited about. I certainly had not agreed to fund anything. I typed back, "Uncle James, I think there's been some confusion. What loan are you referring to? I haven't loaned you any money." The response came back within 2 minutes. "The $500,000 loan. The paperwork went through last week. I know you were hesitant at first, but I'm so glad you decided to support this venture. The property is going to appreciate like crazy and you're going to be so proud you got in on the ground floor." I stared at my phone screen, my heart beginning to pound in a way that had nothing to do with caffeine from my evening tea. $500,000? That was more than 3 times my annual salary. That was more money than I had earned in my entire career to date. That was absolutely insane. There was no possible way I had loaned anyone that amount of money. I did not have that amount of money to loan. My entire net worth, including my retirement accounts and the equity in my condo, was maybe $200,000 at most. I called Uncle James immediately. The phone rang 4 times before he answered, his voice cheerful and energetic. "Maya, did you get my message? I wanted to call you personally to thank you, but I know you're usually working late on Tuesdays, so I figured I'd text first." "Uncle James, I have no idea what you're talking about. I did not loan you $500,000. I don't have $500,000. Where did you get this idea?" There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Then his voice came back, now sounding confused rather than cheerful. "Maya, what do you mean? The loan documents were all processed. The money was transferred. The closing is scheduled for next Monday." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I have no idea what loan documents you're talking about. I never signed anything. I never agreed to any loan. This is the first I'm hearing about any of this. Another silence, longer this time. When Uncle James spoke again, his tone had shifted to something that sounded almost apologetic, but also defensive. "Hold on, let me pull up the paperwork. I have it all here. Maybe there was some miscommunication somewhere along the way." I heard rustling sounds, the clicking of a keyboard, Uncle James muttering to himself. My mind was racing through possibilities. Was this some kind of elaborate misunderstanding? Had someone at a bank made a catastrophic error? Had Uncle James somehow gotten me confused with someone else? None of these explanations made sense, but neither did the alternative that was beginning to form in my mind, the possibility that was too disturbing to fully accept. "Okay, I'm looking at the loan agreement right now," Uncle James said. "It's dated 2 weeks ago, November 10th. It shows a loan amount of $500,000 from Maya Lin Chan to James Chan for business investment purposes. There's a signature here. Your signature. And there's supporting documentation, bank statements showing you have the assets to support this loan, a business plan for the resort development project, a promissory note with repayment terms." "Send me everything," I said, my voice harder now. "Send me photos of all of it right now." "Maya, I don't understand what's happening here. Are you saying you don't remember signing these documents? Because that's concerning. Did something happen? Are you feeling okay?" "Uncle James, I am completely serious. I have never seen these documents. I did not sign anything. I did not agree to loan you any money. Send me the photos right now." Okay. Give me a minute." I sat at my dining table, my dinner now completely forgotten, my work abandoned, staring at my phone and waiting. My hands were shaking slightly. I felt the way I imagine people feel when they are in a car accident, that surreal sense of time moving both too quickly and too slowly, the feeling that reality has become unstable and unpredictable. My phone buzzed with incoming messages. Uncle James was sending photos. I opened them one by one, my sense of dread growing with each image. The first photo showed a loan agreement on official-looking letterhead. It was formatted professionally with legal language about terms and conditions. It specified a loan amount of $500,000 from Maya Lin Chan to James Chan for the purpose of investing in the Cascade Ridge Resort Development Project. It included detailed repayment terms showing monthly interest payments beginning in 6 months and full principal repayment within 5 years. At the bottom of the document was a signature. My signature. Or rather, something that looked very much like my signature, but that I knew with absolute certainty I had never written. The second photo showed bank statements. They appeared to be from my bank with my name and account number, but the balances shown were completely wrong. These statements indicated I had over $600,000 in liquid assets across checking and savings accounts. My actual balances were nowhere near that amount. I had perhaps $40,000 in accessible savings, the remainder of Nai's inheritance that I had not yet applied to my mortgage, plus another $15,000 in checking. These statements were fabricated, created to look legitimate, but showing completely false information. The third photo showed a business plan document for something called Cascade Ridge Resort Development. It was professionally formatted with market analysis, financial projections, architectural renderings of luxury condominiums, and descriptions of amenities including a spa, restaurant, and outdoor recreation facilities. I had never seen this document before. I had no knowledge of any resort development project. The business plan listed James Chan as managing partner and Maya Chan as financial partner with a capital contribution of $500,000. The fourth photo showed a promissory note that mirrored the loan agreement, again with what appeared to be my signature at the bottom, again a signature I knew I had never written. I felt physically ill looking at these documents. Someone had created an elaborate fraud using my identity. Someone had forged my signature on legal documents. Someone had fabricated bank statements to make it appear I had assets I did not actually possess. Someone had built an entire fake paper trail to support a massive loan that I had never authorized or even known about. And my uncle, who I had known my entire life, who had taken me out for dinners and encouraged my career and hired me as a teenager, was either the perpetrator of this fraud or was involved with whoever had perpetrated it. "Uncle James," I said, my voice shaking now despite my efforts to control it, "these documents are fraudulent. That is not my real signature. Those are not my real bank statements. I have never seen any of this before. Someone has stolen my identity and forged documents to make it look like I loaned you money that I absolutely did not loan you." The silence that followed was the longest yet. When Uncle James finally spoke, his voice sounded strained. "Maya, I don't know what to say. These documents came from the attorney who structured this deal. Everything looked legitimate. I thought everything was in order. If what you're saying is true, then someone has defrauded both of us. Who is this attorney? Where did these documents come from? How did this happen?" "His name is Richard Voss. He's someone I've worked with on several deals over the years. He has an office in Boulder. He told me that you had approached him about wanting to invest in one of my projects, that you had cash you wanted to deploy for better returns than you were getting in traditional investments, and that you preferred to handle it through legal channels rather than directly because you wanted proper documentation for tax purposes. He showed me all the paperwork. Everything looked legitimate. My mind was spinning. An attorney was involved in this fraud. This was not just a simple forgery. This was a sophisticated operation with multiple participants and layers of false documentation. This was much worse than I had initially realized. I need all the information you have about this attorney. His full name, office address, phone number, email address, everything. I need the name of the bank or entity that supposedly transferred the $500,000. I need every document related to this supposed loan. And I need it all right now. Maya, if this is really fraud, then we need to contact the police. This is serious. I am going to contact the police. But first I need to understand exactly what has been done using my identity. Send me everything you have right now. Over the next 20 minutes, Uncle James sent me a cascade of documents. There were additional photos of the loan agreement from multiple angles. There were screenshots of email exchanges between Uncle James and this Richard Voss attorney discussing the loan terms. There were copies of wire transfer confirmations showing that $500,000 had been transferred from an account allegedly belonging to me to an account controlled by Uncle James. There were additional pages from the business plan. There were communications about the property purchase that was supposedly closing next week. I sat at my dining room table surrounded by my abandoned work, my cold dinner, and my laptop, scrolling through these documents and trying to comprehend the scope of what had been done. Someone had stolen my identity comprehensively. They had created false financial documents showing assets I did not possess. They had forged my signature on multiple legal agreements. They had somehow executed a wire transfer of money that did not actually exist from an account that was not actually mine. They had built an entire fictional narrative in which I was a willing investor in my uncle's business venture. And most disturbingly, all of this had happened without my knowledge or consent, using information about me that would have required significant access to my personal details. Whoever had done this knew my full legal name, my bank account numbers, enough about my signature to create a convincing forgery, and enough about my relationship with Uncle James to construct a plausible story about family investment. I opened my laptop and logged into my actual bank accounts, my heart pounding as I waited for the pages to load. I needed to verify that my real accounts had not been compromised, that no actual money had been moved without my authorization. The pages loaded showing my normal balances. Nothing was missing. No suspicious transfers appeared in my transaction history. My actual money was still where it was supposed to be. But if my real money was still in my real accounts, where had the $500,000 come from that had supposedly been transferred to Uncle James? I looked more carefully at the wire transfer documentation he had sent me. The sending account number was similar to my real account number, but different by several digits. The bank name was similar to my actual bank but not exactly the same. This was sophisticated fraud that would fool a casual observer, but that fell apart under careful scrutiny. I picked up my phone and called Uncle James again. The account that supposedly sent you the money is not my actual account. The account number is wrong. The bank name is slightly different from my actual bank. Did you verify any of this before accepting the transfer? The attorney handled all of that. He told me everything was processed correctly. The money showed up in the project account exactly when he said it would. I had no reason to doubt anything. So there is actual money in the project account? $500,000 really exists somewhere? Yes, the money is real. It's in the escrow account waiting for the property closing next Monday. Maya, if you didn't send that money, then where did it come from? That was an excellent question. Someone had somehow generated $500,000 in real money, associated that money with my identity through false documentation, and funneled it through to Uncle James's project. This was not just identity theft for the purpose of opening fraudulent credit cards or making unauthorized purchases. This was something far more complex and concerning. I spent the next hour making calls and sending emails despite the late hour. I called my bank's fraud department and reported potential identity theft, requesting that they flag my accounts for any suspicious activity. I called the credit bureaus and placed fraud alerts on my credit reports. I sent an email to my company's IT security team, alerting them to the possibility that my personal information might have been compromised, since my employer had extensive personal data on file for payroll and benefits purposes. I drafted an email to an attorney I knew from professional networking, briefly explaining that I was a victim of identity theft and fraud, and would need legal representation urgently. By the time I finished these immediate protective actions, it was nearly midnight. I was exhausted but far too agitated to sleep. I made myself a cup of tea and sat on my couch, trying to process everything that had happened in the last 3 hours. My uncle had just informed me that someone had stolen my identity to commit fraud involving $500,000. That money was real, and was about to be used to purchase property in my name without my knowledge or consent. An attorney was involved, which meant this was organized and premeditated rather than opportunistic. The fraud had been successful enough that Uncle James had believed it was legitimate, and had proceeded with closing on a property investment based on what he thought was my financial backing. And despite Uncle James's protestations of innocence, despite his apparent surprise when I told him I had not authorized any of this, I could not shake the suspicion that he knew more than he was admitting. He had worked with this Richard Voss attorney on multiple previous deals. He had accepted $500,000 without apparently doing any due diligence to verify that the money actually came from me. He had proceeded with an entire business venture based on paperwork that he should have confirmed directly with me before accepting. Either Uncle James was a willing participant in this fraud, or he was extraordinarily negligent in accepting what turned out to be fraudulent documents without verification, or he was himself being manipulated by sophisticated criminals who had deceived both of us. I did not yet know which of these possibilities was true, but I intended to find out. I also realized something else as I sat there in my living room in the middle of the night, processing this nightmare. The timing of this fraud was not coincidental. This had happened within 3 months of me receiving Nai's inheritance. Someone knew that I had recently received a sum of money. Someone had used that knowledge to construct a plausible narrative, in which I supposedly had liquid assets available to invest. The fraud was not random. It was targeted and informed by specific knowledge about my financial situation. The most disturbing implication was that someone with access to family information had either perpetrated this fraud, or had provided information to others who had perpetrated it. This was not a stranger stealing my identity through a data breach at some company I did business with. This was someone who knew me, knew my family relationships, knew about my grandmother's estate, and knew enough details about my life to construct a convincing fraud. I finally went to bed around 2 in the morning, knowing I would not sleep well but needing to at least try to rest before dealing with this crisis in the morning. I lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling, my mind cycling through the same questions over and over. Who had done this? How had they obtained my information? Was Uncle James involved or merely incompetent? Where was the $500,000 actually from? What was going to happen when the property sale was supposed to close and the fraud was exposed? And underneath all of these practical questions was a deeper emotional question that I was only beginning to confront. If my own family was involved in stealing my identity and defrauding me, who could I trust? What did it say about my judgment that I had maintained relationships with people who were capable of this kind of betrayal? How many other things about my family relationships had I misunderstood or been naive about? I finally fell into an uneasy sleep sometime after 3 in the morning, my phone on my nightstand within reach, half expecting it to ring with another devastating revelation before the night was over. I woke up Wednesday morning after perhaps 3 hours of fragmented sleep, my mind immediately flooding with the reality of what had happened the night before. For a brief moment upon waking, I experienced that merciful confusion where the memory has not yet fully returned, where the world still seems normal. Then it all came crashing back. Someone had stolen my identity, $500,000 in fraudulent loans, forged signatures, my uncle claiming I had invested in his resort project, an attorney named Richard Voss who had supposedly facilitated everything. I called in sick to work, something I had done perhaps 3 times in my entire 8-year career with the company. My boss was understanding when I explained I had a family emergency that required immediate attention. I did not elaborate, and he did not press for details. I sent apologetic messages to my team members who would have to cover the presentation I was supposed to deliver that morning. Then I made coffee, sat down at my dining room table with my laptop, and began the process of understanding how I had arrived at this crisis. The relationship between Uncle James and me had not always been complicated. When I was very young, before my parents divorced, Uncle James was simply one of several relatives who appeared at holiday gatherings and birthday celebrations. He was the fun uncle who brought elaborate gifts, who told entertaining stories, who seemed more relaxed and jovial than my serious workaholic father. I have early memories of Uncle James tossing me in the air and catching me while I shrieked with delighted terror, of him sneaking me extra desserts when my mother was not watching, of him teaching me card tricks and magic tricks that amazed my elementary school friends. The dynamic shifted significantly after my parents' divorce when I was 12. The divorce was acrimonious and drawn out, a process that took nearly 2 years to finalize because my parents could not agree on asset division or custody arrangements. During this period, my father withdrew emotionally from nearly everyone, including me. He worked longer hours, spent more time at the office, and seemed to have little energy for parenting when he was home. My mother was consumed with her own anger and pain, using me as a confidant in ways that were inappropriate for a child, telling me details about the divorce proceedings and her grievances against my father that I should never have been burdened with hearing. Uncle James stepped into this void in some ways. He called me regularly to check how I was doing. He took me out for meals or activities when he was in town, giving me breaks from the tense atmosphere at home. He listened when I talked about how confused and hurt I felt about my family falling apart. He told me that the divorce was not my fault, that both of my parents loved me even though they were handling things badly, and that I was going to be okay even though everything felt chaotic and frightening at the moment. I desperately needed that support during those difficult years, and Uncle James provided it when my own parents were too wrapped up in their conflict to meet my emotional needs. I became attached to him in ways that went beyond normal extended family relationships. He became a kind of surrogate parent, someone I felt actually saw me and cared about my well-being when my actual parents seemed barely aware of my existence beyond the logistics of custody schedules. Looking back now with adult perspective and the knowledge of what had just been done to me, I could recognize that Uncle James had established himself as a uniquely trusted figure during a period when I was vulnerable and desperate for stability. Whether he had done so deliberately as a long-term manipulation or whether he had genuinely cared about me during that time was a question I could not yet answer. But the effect was undeniable. I had developed a loyalty to Uncle James that exceeded what I felt toward my own parents, and that loyalty had persisted well into my adulthood. During my teenage years, Uncle James employed me in various capacities for his different business ventures. When I was 14, he hired me to answer phones for a property management company he was running. The office was small and chaotic, located in a strip mall, with piles of paperwork everywhere and a constantly ringing phone. Uncle James paid me $12 an hour, which seemed generous for a teenager with no work experience. I spent my summer afternoons sitting at a desk, taking messages from tenants with maintenance complaints, scheduling appointments for property showings, and trying to bring some order to the filing system that had devolved into barely organized chaos. Uncle James praised my work enthusiastically. He told me I was far more competent than the adult employees he had hired previously, that I had a natural aptitude for organization and customer service, and that he was lucky to have me on his team. This praise felt wonderful to a 14-year-old girl whose parents barely noticed her existence. I worked hard to deserve his approval, staying late without being asked, taking initiative to solve problems without supervision, and genuinely caring about doing the job well. When I was 16, Uncle James was involved in a restaurant venture with several business partners. It was an upscale Asian fusion concept in a trendy Denver neighborhood, the kind of place that attracted young professionals and featured creative cocktails with elaborate garnishes. Uncle James hired me as a hostess on weekends. I greeted customers, managed the reservation system, and handled the chaos of busy Friday and Saturday nights when people without reservations would hover near the entrance hoping for cancellations or no-shows. The restaurant was beautiful, with modern decor and an open kitchen where you could watch the chefs working. Uncle James was there most evenings, moving between the kitchen and dining room, chatting with customers, buying drinks for regulars, and projecting an image of successful restaurateur. He introduced me to customers as his brilliant niece who was going to run a Fortune 500 company someday. He told me I was representing the family and that he was proud to have me working there. The restaurant lasted about 18 months before closing due to what Uncle James described as conflicts with his business partners and unforeseen market challenges. I never learned the full story of what happened, but I knew that Uncle James lost significant money in the venture, and that the relationships with his partners ended badly with accusations and threatened lawsuits. Despite this failure, Uncle James seemed to bounce back quickly, immediately beginning to plan his next project with the same enthusiasm and confidence he had brought to the restaurant. When I was applying to colleges during my senior year of high school, Uncle James was more involved in the process than either of my parents. My mother was busy with her new marriage and stepchildren. My father was consumed with his law practice and his own new family. Uncle James was the one who sat down with me to discuss different schools, who helped me think through the financial implications of various options, and who encouraged me to pursue institutions that would challenge me academically, even if they were more expensive. I ultimately chose the University of Colorado Boulder, partly because it offered a good program in my intended major, partly because the in-state tuition made it financially feasible, and partly because it was close enough to Denver that I could maintain connections with the few family members who seemed to care about me. Uncle James gave me $500 as a high school graduation gift, a sum that seemed extraordinarily generous at the time, and that I used to purchase textbooks and supplies for my first semester. During my college years, Uncle James maintained regular contact in ways my parents did not. He sent text messages asking how my classes were going, and whether I was enjoying the college experience. He invited me to lunch or dinner when he had business in Boulder, which happened every few months. During these meals he asked detailed questions about my studies, my career aspirations, and my life. He offered advice about navigating professional relationships, building networks, and positioning myself for success after graduation. These conversations felt meaningful and valuable. Uncle James treated me like an adult whose opinions and experiences mattered, unlike my parents who still seemed to view me as a child whose primary function was to comply with their custody arrangements and not cause problems. Uncle James talked to me about business concepts, economic trends, and professional strategies. He lent me books about entrepreneurship and investing. He told me stories about deals he was working on and asked for my analytical perspective on various business decisions he was considering. I recognize now that these conversations served multiple purposes beyond simple mentorship. Uncle James was educating me about business and finance in ways that made me feel sophisticated and valued. He was also conditioning me to see him as a legitimate business person whose ventures were serious and worthwhile, despite the pattern of failures that should have raised concerns. He was establishing himself as someone who respected my intelligence and sought my input, which created a sense of reciprocal obligation. If he valued my opinion, should I not also support his efforts when opportunities arose? When I graduated with my bachelor's degree, Uncle James attended the ceremony. My mother did not attend because she was dealing with some issue with one of my stepbrothers. My father attended but left immediately after the ceremony to catch a flight for a business trip. Uncle James stayed for the whole day, took me and several of my friends out for a celebratory dinner, and gave me a check for $1,000 as a graduation gift. He told me he was proud of me, that I had accomplished something significant, and that I was going to do remarkable things with my education and abilities. That validation meant everything to me at 22 years old. I had worked multiple part-time jobs throughout college to supplement my financial aid and minimize student loans. I had maintained a strong GPA while juggling work and coursework. I had earned my degree through genuine effort and sacrifice. My parents had offered minimal support and had shown little interest in my achievements. Uncle James was the only family member who seemed to recognize and celebrate what I had accomplished. When I decided to pursue a master's degree in data analytics, Uncle James was enthusiastically supportive. He told me it was an excellent decision that would significantly increase my earning potential and career opportunities. He helped me think through the costs and benefits of various programs. He offered advice about how to position myself in the job market after completing the degree. He sent me an article about the growing importance of data analytics in healthcare, suggesting it might be a particularly promising field to focus on. I completed my master's degree while working full-time in an entry-level analyst position at a healthcare consulting firm. It was an exhausting 2 years of evening classes, weekend study sessions, and constant juggling of work obligations and academic deadlines. Uncle James checked in regularly during this period, sending encouraging messages and occasionally taking me out for meals where he listened to me talk about the challenges I was facing and offered perspective about how this difficult period would pay dividends throughout my career. When I completed my master's degree, Uncle James gave me $2,000 as a graduation gift. It was a stunning amount of money from my perspective at that time. I was 25 years old, earning $55,000 at my consulting job, carrying about $30,000 in student loan debt, and trying to save money while paying rent and managing basic living expenses. $2,000 represented more than a month of my take-home pay. I was overwhelmed by his generosity and deeply grateful for his ongoing support of my education and career development. Looking back at this history now, sitting at my dining room table on Wednesday morning trying to understand how I had become the victim of massive identity theft, I had to confront uncomfortable questions about Uncle James's motivations during all those years. Had he genuinely cared about supporting his niece through difficult periods and celebrating her achievements? Or had he been making a long-term investment, establishing trust and loyalty that he planned to exploit eventually for financial gain? I did not want to believe that every kind gesture, every word of encouragement, every expression of pride in my accomplishments had been calculated manipulation. That interpretation would mean that I had been deceived for more than 2 decades, that my entire understanding of one of my most important family relationships was fundamentally false. But I also could not ignore the possibility that Uncle James had deliberately cultivated my trust during my vulnerable teenage years, and had maintained that trust through strategic gestures and attention, all in service of eventually being able to exploit me financially. The pattern of Uncle James asking for my help with small business tasks had begun about 3 years into my professional career. By that point, I was 28 years old, earning a solid salary as a data analyst, and had developed genuine expertise in statistical analysis, data visualization, and translating complex quantitative information into actionable insights. Uncle James started sending me occasional requests to review spreadsheets or business proposals he was working on. These requests were framed as seeking my professional opinion, valuing my analytical expertise, and recognizing that I had skills that could help him make better business decisions. The tasks were not particularly time-consuming, usually requiring an hour or 2 of my time to review documents and provide feedback. I was happy to help because it made me feel valued, and because I genuinely wanted Uncle James to succeed after watching so many of his previous ventures fail. I reviewed financial projections for a commercial property he was considering purchasing, pointing out that the assumed rental rates seemed optimistic given comparable properties in the area and suggesting he build in more conservative assumptions. I analyzed demographic data for a retail concept he was developing, showing him that his target customer base was smaller than he had estimated and recommending adjustments to his business model. I created data visualizations that helped him present investment opportunities more effectively to potential partners. Uncle James was always effusively grateful for this help. He told me that my input was invaluable, that I had insights he never would have developed on his own, and that I was helping him avoid costly mistakes. This feedback reinforced my willingness to continue providing assistance. I felt like I was contributing something meaningful, using my professional skills to help family, and perhaps helping Uncle James finally achieve the business success that had eluded him for so long. The request to invest in the strip mall property 5 years ago had emerged from this established pattern of me providing analytical assistance and Uncle James valuing my input. He presented it not as asking for a loan or favor, but as offering me an opportunity to benefit from my own good advice. I had reviewed the strip mall investment projections and told him it looked promising. He then suggested that since I recognized the opportunity's value, perhaps I would want to participate as an investor rather than just as an advisor. The logic seemed sound at the time. I had some savings accumulated. Real estate investment was widely recognized as a reliable wealth-building strategy. The projected returns were attractive. And this was family, someone who had supported me throughout my life, someone I trusted completely. I agreed to invest $15,000, a significant portion of my savings, but not so much that it would leave me financially vulnerable if the investment did not work out as planned. The investment had not worked out as planned. The quarterly reports stopped coming after about a year. My questions about the property's performance were met with vague explanations about temporary challenges and administrative delays. Eventually, I accepted that I was unlikely to see that money again, and resolved to be more cautious about mixing family and finances in the future. But I had not cut off my relationship with Uncle James over that failed investment. I had rationalized it as a business venture that did not work out, a risk that anyone takes when investing in real estate, not a personal betrayal. Uncle James had never explicitly promised guaranteed returns. He had presented it as an opportunity with risk, and risk meant the possibility of loss. I blamed market conditions and bad luck rather than attributing any malicious intent to Uncle James. This rationalization had allowed me to maintain the relationship, to continue seeing Uncle James at family gatherings, to continue exchanging occasional messages and having occasional meals together. I had recalibrated my boundaries to exclude future financial entanglements, while preserving what I still believed was a valuable family connection. Uncle James was still the person who had supported me through my parents' divorce, who had encouraged my education, who had celebrated my achievements when my actual parents could not be bothered. Now I had to reconsider that entire narrative. The failed strip mall investment looked very different when viewed in context with the current identity theft situation. Had that earlier investment been a test of my willingness to trust Uncle James financially? Had it been a way to establish a precedent of me providing money for his projects? Had the vague explanations and eventual ghosting on that investment been deliberate, rather than the result of genuine business challenges? I opened my laptop and began searching for information about the strip mall property I had invested in 5 years earlier. I had the address saved in my old email correspondence with Uncle James. I pulled up property records and recent sales data. The strip mall had been sold 3 years ago for a substantial profit. If my investment had been legitimate and if Uncle James had honored his commitments to the investors, I should have received my initial investment back plus a share of the appreciation. I had received nothing. I felt physically sick as this realization settled over me. Uncle James had sold a property that I had invested in, had presumably made significant profit from that sale, and had never mentioned it to me or provided any return on my investment. This was not a business venture that had failed due to market conditions. This was theft. He had taken my money, used it for his purposes, profited from it, and kept everything for himself. I began pulling up every email and text message exchange I had ever had with Uncle James, searching for other instances where he might have deceived me or taken advantage of me financially. I created a timeline document noting every time he had asked for my analytical help, every time he had requested a favor, every financial transaction between us. The pattern that emerged was deeply disturbing. Uncle James had been systematically extracting value from me for years. Sometimes it was my labor, spending hours reviewing his business documents without compensation. Sometimes it was my money, as with the strip mall investment. Sometimes it was my professional reputation, as when he told potential business partners that his analyst niece had reviewed his projects and given them her endorsement. He had been treating me as a resource to be exploited, while maintaining the facade of a caring uncle who valued our relationship. The $15,000 investment was only the most obvious instance. When I calculated the hours I had spent reviewing his business documents over the years and applied my professional hourly rate, I had provided him with at least $25,000 worth of unpaid consulting services. When I considered the opportunities one had passed up because I was spending time on his projects such as professional development courses or networking events, the opportunity cost was even higher. And now someone, quite possibly Uncle James himself, had escalated from these smaller exploitations to massive identity theft involving $500,000. The progression made terrible sense. He had established my trust over decades. He had conditioned me to provide financial assistance and professional services. He had tested my boundaries with the strip mall investment and learned that I would not aggressively pursue accountability when he failed to deliver on his commitments. Each successful exploitation had set the stage for the next larger one. I needed to understand more about Uncle James's actual financial situation and business history. I began researching public records, business filings, and court documents. What I discovered over the next several hours painted a picture that was dramatically different from the successful entrepreneur image Uncle James projected. Uncle James had filed for bankruptcy 7 years ago, listing debts of over $200,000 and minimal assets. He had been sued multiple times by former business partners alleging fraud, breach of contract, and misappropriation of funds. Most of these lawsuits had been settled out of court with confidentiality agreements, which explained why I had never heard about them. He had multiple liens filed against him by contractors and suppliers who had not been paid for work on his various projects. His pattern across multiple businesses was remarkably consistent. He would start a venture with funding from investors or partners. He would spend money rapidly on the visible aspects of the business, such as fancy offices, expensive equipment, or lavish marketing, while neglecting fundamental operational necessities. When the business inevitably struggled, he would blame external factors or his partners rather than his own mismanagement. When the business failed or when he was forced out by angry partners, he would move on to the next project without taking responsibility for the damage left behind. The restaurant where I had worked as a teenage hostess had closed, owing money to dozens of vendors and leaving employees with unpaid wages. The property management company where I had answered phones had been shut down after multiple housing code violations and complaints about misappropriated tenant security deposits. The import-export business had collapsed after his partner discovered that Uncle James had been creating false invoices and diverting company funds to personal expenses. I felt increasingly nauseated as I read through these records. The person I had trusted and admired was revealed to be a consistent fraudster who had left a trail of financial wreckage and damaged relationships across decades. And I had been defending him, making excuses for him, and maintaining loyalty to him even when evidence of his character was available if I had been willing to look for it. My phone rang, interrupting my research. It was my father calling, which was unusual since we typically only communicated through text messages for logistical matters. I answered hesitantly, uncertain whether I was ready to discuss the identity theft situation with him yet. "Maya, I just got a very strange call from James," my father said without preamble. His voice had the clipped, efficient tone of someone squeezing a personal call into a busy workday. "He said something about a loan you supposedly gave him, and now you are claiming you never gave him any money. What is going on?" I explained the situation as clearly and factually as I could. Someone had stolen my identity and created fraudulent documents showing I had loaned Uncle James $500,000 for a resort investment. I had not signed any documents, had not authorized any loan, and had not even known about the supposed investment until Uncle James texted me to thank me for money I had never given him. My father was silent for a long moment after I finished explaining. Then he said something that I had not expected. "Maya, I need to tell you something about James that I should have told you years ago. Your grandmother asked me not to say anything because she did not want to create family conflict, but given what has happened, you need to know." My father's words hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. I shifted in my chair, my laptop screen still displaying court records and bankruptcy filings related to Uncle James, and waited for my father to continue. The silence stretched for several seconds, and I could hear him taking a breath as though preparing himself for a difficult confession. "About 15 years ago, when you were in college, James approached your grandmother for money," my father began, his lawyer's voice measured and precise. "He told her he needed $50,000 to save a business that was failing. He said if he didn't get the money within a week, he would lose everything he had worked for. He told her he had approached banks and other investors, but couldn't get financing quickly enough. He told her he was desperate." I said nothing, letting my father continue at his own pace. I had a sinking feeling about where this story was heading, but I needed to hear it in full. "Your grandmother gave him the money. She liquidated a certificate of deposit that she had been saving for years, money she had planned to use for medical expenses in her old age, or to leave to her grandchildren. She gave it to James because he was her son and he told her he was in crisis. He promised to repay her within 6 months once the business recovered." My father paused again, and I heard what might have been him taking a sip of water or coffee. "He never repaid her. Not $1. When she asked him about it a few months later, he told her the business had failed despite his best efforts and that he had lost everything. He said he felt terrible about not being able to repay her, but that the money was gone. He asked her not to tell the rest of the family because he was ashamed of the failure. I felt a cold fury beginning to build in my chest. And she protected him. She kept his secret. She did. my father confirmed. Your grandmother believed in family loyalty above almost everything else. She did not want to create conflict between her children or damage James's relationship with the rest of the family. She made me promise not to tell anyone, including you. She said it was between her and James and that bringing others into it would only cause pain without solving anything. When did you find out about this? I asked. About 10 years ago. Your grandmother told me because she needed some legal advice about whether she could write James out of her will as a consequence of him never repaying her. I advised her that she could structure her estate however she wished, but I also told her that doing so would likely create exactly the kind of family conflict she was trying to avoid. Ultimately, she decided to treat all her children and grandchildren equally in her will despite what James had done. I thought about the inheritance I had received from Nai 3 months ago, the $25,000 that I had planned to use to pay down my mortgage early. Uncle James had received the same amount, an equal share despite having stolen from her years earlier and never making restitution. Why are you telling me this now? I asked my father. Because James called me and told me you are making accusations against him, claiming that documents are forged and that you never agreed to any loan. He wanted me to talk to you to convince you that you are mistaken or confused. He suggested that perhaps you signed documents and forgot about it, or that you are having some kind of mental health crisis that is causing you to make false accusations. The audacity of Uncle James trying to use my own father to gaslight me into doubting my own experience was breathtaking. And what did you tell him? I told him I would speak with you and assess the situation myself, my father said. But Maya, based on what you have told me and based on what I know about James's history, I believe you completely. I believe he is involved in fraud against you. Just as he defrauded your grandmother years ago, the pattern is identical. He identifies someone who trusts him, he creates a story about a business opportunity or financial need, he extracts money or resources, and then when confronted, he lies and manipulates to avoid accountability. Hearing my father, who I had never been close to and who had always seemed more interested in his legal practice than in his daughter's life, state his belief in me so clearly and unequivocally was unexpectedly moving. My throat tightened and I had to swallow before I could speak. Thank you for telling me. I wish I had known about what he did to Nai years ago. It would have changed how I understood our relationship. I should have told you despite your grandmother's wishes, my father said, and there was something that might have been regret in his usually businesslike tone. I was honoring her request, but I was also avoiding conflict with James and the rest of the family. That was a mistake. If you had known about his history, perhaps you would have been more cautious, perhaps this current situation would not have happened. We talked for a few more minutes about practical next steps. My father gave me the name of a criminal defense attorney he knew, who specialized in identity theft and fraud cases. He offered to make some preliminary calls on my behalf to law enforcement contacts, who might be able to expedite the investigation. He told me that if I needed anything, any kind of support or assistance as this situation unfolded, I should contact him directly. After we ended the call, I sat for a long time processing what I had learned. Uncle James had stolen $50,000 from his own elderly mother, and had never repaid it. He had manipulated her into keeping his theft secret, by playing on her desire to maintain family harmony. He had faced no consequences for that theft, had continued to be included in family gatherings and treated as a valued family member, and had ultimately inherited from the very person he had stolen from years earlier. And now, apparently emboldened by decades of successfully exploiting family members without accountability, he had escalated to stealing my identity and committing fraud involving 10 times the amount he had taken from Nai. The progression was logical in a horrible way. Each successful exploitation had taught him that family members would not aggressively pursue justice against him, that loyalty and desire to avoid conflict would protect him from consequences, and that he could continue to extract resources from people who trusted him. I began to wonder who else in the family had been victimized by Uncle James over the years. How many other loans had never been repaid? How many other investments had never generated the promised returns? How many other people had provided him with money, labor, expertise, or other resources that he had consumed for his own purposes while giving nothing back? I spent the rest of Wednesday alternating between researching Uncle James's business history, documenting everything I knew about the current identity theft situation, and making calls to various institutions and authorities. I spoke with a detective in the Economic Crimes Unit of the Denver Police Department and filed a formal identity theft report. I spoke with the Federal Trade Commission and filed a complaint through their identity theft reporting system. I contacted the 3 major credit bureaus again to ensure that fraud alerts were properly placed and to request copies of my credit reports to check for any other unauthorized accounts or inquiries. I also began the process of documenting my own relationship with Uncle James over the years. I created a detailed timeline starting from my childhood and noting every significant interaction, every request for help, every financial transaction, and every instance where he had failed to deliver on a commitment. I wrote out descriptions of the strip mall investment, including the fact that the property had been sold for a profit and that I had never received any return on my investment despite Uncle James's original promises. This documentation served multiple purposes. It helped me process my own experience and see patterns I had not recognized while living through events in real time. It created a record that would be useful if legal proceedings required me to demonstrate a history of exploitation. And it gave me something concrete to focus on, a task that felt productive when I was otherwise consumed with anxiety and anger about the situation. By Wednesday evening, I was exhausted but also strangely energized. The shock of the initial discovery had worn off, replaced by a cold determination to understand exactly what had been done to me and to ensure that appropriate consequences followed. I was no longer the confused victim frantically trying to understand what was happening. I was beginning to become something else, someone who was gathering information systematically and preparing to take decisive action. I ordered dinner from a nearby restaurant, forcing myself to eat even though I had little appetite. I needed to maintain my physical health and mental clarity through what was clearly going to be an extended and stressful process. After eating, I made myself go for a walk around my neighborhood, getting fresh air and movement to counteract the hours I had spent hunched over my laptop. As I walked through the early evening darkness, passing houses lit warmly from within where families were presumably having normal Wednesday evenings unmarred by identity theft and family betrayal, I found myself thinking about the person I had been just 24 hours earlier. That version of Maya had believed certain things about her family, about her uncle, about her own judgment. She had understood her life story in a particular way that positioned Uncle James as a supportive figure who had helped her through difficult times. That narrative was now shattered. I was having to reconstruct my understanding of my own history, reinterpreting events through a new lens that revealed manipulation where I had seen mentorship, exploitation where I had seen opportunity, and calculated grooming where I had seen genuine affection. This process was painful but also clarifying. I was beginning to see myself more accurately, understanding how my vulnerabilities as a child of divorce had been leveraged, how my desire for approval and belonging had been exploited, and how my professional expertise had been extracted without fair compensation. But I was also beginning to recognize strengths I had not fully appreciated before. I had put myself through college and graduate school largely on my own, managing work and study simultaneously while receiving minimal support from my parents. I had built a successful career through genuine competence and hard work. I had developed valuable analytical skills that had served me well professionally, and that were now serving me as I investigated what had been done to me. I had survived difficult circumstances in my childhood and young adulthood, and had emerged as a capable, independent adult despite rather than because of my family situation. When I returned home from my walk, I found several new messages on my phone. One was from the detective I had spoken with that morning, confirming that my case had been assigned an official case number, and that an investigation was being opened. One was from my father, forwarding contact information for the attorney he had recommended and noting that he had already spoken with her briefly about my situation. One was from my supervisor at work, checking to see if everything was okay, and whether I needed any additional time off. And one was from Uncle James. The message was long and rambling, a mixture of confusion, defensiveness, and what appeared to be an attempt at emotional manipulation. He wrote that he could not understand why I was claiming not to have given him the loan when all the paperwork clearly showed my involvement. He suggested that perhaps I had been under a lot of stress and had forgotten signing the documents. He wrote that he was worried about me and thought perhaps I should see a doctor to rule out any medical issues that might be affecting my memory. He said that he loved me and did not want this misunderstanding to damage our relationship. He said that the property closing was happening on Monday regardless of this confusion, and that once the investment started generating returns, I would see that this had all been worthwhile. Reading this message, I felt my anger crystallizing into something colder and more focused. Uncle James was not going to acknowledge what he had done. He was going to continue lying, continue manipulating, continue trying to make me doubt my own experience and perception. He was going to try to proceed with his fraudulent property purchase using my stolen identity as though nothing was wrong. He genuinely believed, based on decades of successfully exploiting family members without consequences, that he could talk his way out of this situation just as he had talked his way out of every previous situation. He was wrong. This time was going to be different. This time he had targeted someone who had the resources, knowledge, and determination to pursue accountability. This time he had left a paper trail that could be investigated by law enforcement. This time the amounts involved were large enough to constitute serious criminal charges, rather than civil matters that could be settled privately. And this time, I was not going to be deterred by appeals to family loyalty or desire to avoid conflict. I did not respond to Uncle James's message. There was nothing to say to him directly. He knew exactly what he had done. Any conversation would only give him an opportunity to continue his manipulation tactics. Instead, I forwarded his message to the detective handling my case and to the attorney my father had connected me with, noting that it represented an attempt to make me doubt my own experience and to proceed with a fraudulent transaction despite knowing that I had not authorized it. I spent Thursday morning meeting with the attorney my father had recommended, a woman named Patricia Hendricks who specialized in financial crimes and identity theft cases. Her office was in a downtown high-rise with views of the mountains beyond the city. She was perhaps 50 years old, professionally dressed, with a kind of calm, focused demeanor that inspired confidence. She listened carefully as I explained the situation, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly letting me tell the story without interruption. When I finished, she asked to see all the documentation I had gathered. I had brought my laptop and walked her through the fraudulent loan documents Uncle James had sent me, the timeline I had created of our relationship, the public records I had found regarding his business history and legal troubles, the evidence that the strip mall property I had invested in years ago had been sold without me receiving any return on my investment, and the recent message from Uncle James attempting to convince me I had forgotten signing loan documents. Patricia reviewed everything methodically, taking notes on a legal pad, and occasionally pulling up additional information on her own computer. After about 90 minutes, she sat back and looked at me directly. Maya, what has been done to you is serious criminal fraud. Based on what you have shown me, it appears that someone created false financial documents in your name, forged your signature on legal agreements, and used your identity to obtain $500,000 that is about to be used to purchase real property. This is not a civil matter that can be resolved through negotiation. This requires criminal prosecution. I nodded, having already come to that conclusion myself but appreciating her clear articulation of it. The question is whether your uncle is the primary perpetrator or whether he is also a victim of someone else's fraud scheme, Patricia continued. His message to you claiming confusion and suggesting you forgot signing documents is problematic. Either he is genuinely confused, which seems unlikely given the detailed nature of the fraudulent documents, or he is knowingly participating in fraud and attempting to manipulate you into accepting it. I think he is knowingly participating, I said. Based on his history of defrauding my grandmother and others, based on his pattern of financial mismanagement and dishonesty across multiple businesses, and based on the fact that the timing of this fraud coincides with me receiving an inheritance that would make it plausible I had money to invest, I believe he either orchestrated this fraud or collaborated with someone else to perpetrate it. Patricia nodded slowly. That is my assessment as well. The attorney he claims facilitated this transaction, Richard Voss, needs to be investigated immediately. If Voss is a real attorney who was deceived by forged documents, then he may be another victim. If Voss is complicit or if Voss does not actually exist and is simply a fictional character created to add legitimacy to the fraud, then that tells us something important about the sophistication of this scheme. She explained the next steps we needed to take. She would coordinate with the detective handling the criminal investigation to ensure that all relevant information was shared. She would file legal motions to block the property purchase scheduled for Monday, arguing that the transaction was based on fraudulent documentation and stolen identity. She would send formal legal notices to Uncle James, to the Richard Voss attorney if he could be located, and to any financial institutions involved in the transaction, putting them all on notice that identity theft and fraud had occurred and that they should cease any further actions related to the supposed loan. "I need to be very clear with you about something," Patricia said as our meeting was concluding. "Taking legal action against a family member, even a family member who has committed fraud against you, is going to be extremely difficult emotionally and socially. Other family members may pressure you to drop the matter to preserve family harmony. They may suggest that pursuing criminal charges is excessive or vindictive. They may tell you that you are tearing the family apart. You need to be prepared for that response, and you need to be absolutely certain that you are willing to follow through regardless of that pressure." I met her eyes steadily. "I am certain. What he has done is not just wrong in a moral sense. It is criminal. If I do not pursue accountability, he will do this to someone else. He has been exploiting family members for decades without consequences. That pattern has to end, and if I am the one who has to end it, then so be it." Patricia smiled slightly, an expression that suggested both approval and recognition. "Good. You are going to need that resolve. Now let's make sure we document everything properly and build the strongest possible case." I left her office feeling more grounded than I had since this nightmare began. I had professional legal representation. I had a clear plan of action. I had law enforcement involvement. I was no longer dealing with this crisis alone or relying solely on my own resources to navigate an unfamiliar and complex situation. I had assembled a team of people with relevant expertise who could help me pursue justice. Thursday afternoon, I received a call from Detective Morrison, the officer handling my identity theft case. He had received the documentation I had sent him and had begun preliminary investigation. He had attempted to contact Richard Voss at the office address listed on the loan documents and had found that no such attorney was registered at that location. The business address was actually a virtual office service that provided mail forwarding and occasional conference room access, but that did not have permanent tenants. He had checked with the Colorado Bar Association and found that while a Richard Voss was registered as an attorney, that attorney worked for a large corporate law firm and specialized in intellectual property law, not in business loans or real estate transactions. This information strongly suggested that the Richard Voss involved in the fraudulent loan was either not actually an attorney, or was someone using a real attorney's name without authorization. Either scenario pointed toward a sophisticated fraud operation, rather than a simple mistake or misunderstanding. Detective Morrison told me that he was escalating the investigation and would be coordinating with federal authorities given the interstate nature of the fraud and the large dollar amounts involved. He also told me something that made my blood run cold. The $500,000 that had supposedly been loaned to Uncle James had actually come from a wire transfer originating from an account at a bank in the Cayman Islands. The money had been routed through several intermediate accounts before arriving in the escrow account for the property purchase. This suggested money laundering in addition to identity theft and fraud. "Miss Chun, I need to ask you something directly," Detective Morrison said, his voice serious. "Is there any possibility that you have been involved in any way with offshore accounts, cryptocurrency transactions, or any financial activities that might explain how your identity became connected to this Cayman Islands account?" "Absolutely not," I said firmly. "I have never had any offshore accounts. I have never been involved in any unusual financial activities. My finances are completely straightforward. I have checking and savings accounts at a regular bank, a retirement account through my employer, and a mortgage on my condo. That is the full extent of my financial situation." "That is what I expected based on your financial records, but I had to ask," the detective said. "What this means is that someone has created an extensive false financial identity using your personal information. They have not just forged a few documents. They have created banking relationships, moved large sums of money internationally, and built an entire fictitious financial profile under your name. This is significantly more serious than typical identity theft cases." After ending that call, I sat in my living room feeling a new level of fear. This was not just Uncle James asking me for money and forging some paperwork when I said no. This was a sophisticated criminal operation involving international banking, money laundering, and identity theft on a scale I had not initially comprehended. I was not just dealing with a dishonest family member. I was somehow entangled in serious financial crimes that could potentially implicate me if not handled correctly. I called Patricia Hendricks immediately and relayed what Detective Morrison had told me. She listened carefully and then said something that was both reassuring and sobering. Maya, the complexity of this fraud actually works in your favor in some ways. The sophistication required to set up Cayman Islands accounts, route money through multiple intermediaries, and create the kind of documentation that was presented to your uncle suggests that this is not something a small-time con artist could accomplish alone. This points toward organized fraud, possibly involving multiple perpetrators with specialized skills. That means law enforcement will take it very seriously. It also means that you are clearly a victim rather than a participant, because you obviously do not have the knowledge or resources to create this kind of scheme. She paused, and I could hear her typing notes. However, it also means that we need to be extremely careful about protecting you legally. Until we understand who actually orchestrated this fraud and how they obtained your personal information, you are potentially at risk for further identity theft, or for being implicated in other crimes committed using your identity. We need to get ahead of this aggressively. We spent the next hour discussing additional protective measures. Patricia advised me to place security freezes on my credit reports with all 3 bureaus, which would prevent anyone from opening new accounts in my name. She suggested I change passwords on all my financial accounts and enable 2-factor authentication everywhere possible. She recommended that I review my tax records to ensure no fraudulent tax returns had been filed in my name. She told me to check my Social Security statement online to verify that no unauthorized employment was being reported under my Social Security number. By Thursday evening, I was mentally and emotionally exhausted. I had spent 2 full days absorbing devastating revelations about my uncle's character and history, discovering that my identity had been stolen for a sophisticated international fraud scheme, meeting with attorneys and law enforcement, and taking countless protective actions to secure my finances and legal position. I felt like I had been running a marathon while carrying a heavy weight, and I knew that I was only at the beginning of what was likely to be a long and difficult process. I made myself a simple dinner, took a long hot shower, and went to bed early. As I lay in the darkness trying to quiet my racing thoughts enough to sleep, I found myself thinking about Nai, my grandmother who had died 2 years earlier. She had been the center of our family, the person who had held everyone together and maintained traditions and connections across generations. She had been kind and generous, sometimes to her own detriment, as evidenced by her decision to give Uncle James $50,000 she could not afford to lose and then to protect him from accountability by keeping his theft secret. I wondered what she would think about what was happening now. Would she be disappointed in me for taking legal action against her son? Would she understand that his pattern of exploitation had escalated to the point where criminal prosecution was necessary? Would she recognize that her own decision to prioritize family harmony over justice had enabled Uncle James to continue victimizing others? I would never know the answers to those questions, but lying there in the darkness of my bedroom, I made a decision about how I was going to approach everything that was coming. I was going to honor Nai's values of family loyalty and maintaining connections, but I was going to interpret those values differently than she had. Real family loyalty did not mean protecting people from the consequences of their harmful actions. Real connection did not mean sacrificing your own well-being to avoid conflict. True family strength came from honesty, accountability, and mutual respect, not from covering up wrongs to maintain a false appearance of harmony. I was going to pursue justice for what had been done to me, not out of revenge or vindictiveness, but because it was the right thing to do. I was going to document the truth and share it with people who needed to know, not to hurt Uncle James but to protect others from being similarly victimized. I was going to hold firm to appropriate boundaries and refuse to be manipulated by appeals to family obligation, not because I did not value family, but because I understood that family relationships should be based on genuine care, rather than exploitation. And perhaps most importantly, I was going to stop blaming myself for having been deceived. I had trusted someone who presented himself as trustworthy. I had believed someone who told me he cared about me. I had tried to help someone who claimed to need support. Those were not failures of judgment. Those were normal human responses to relationships with people who claimed to be acting in good faith. The failure was not mine for trusting. The failure was Uncle James's for betraying that trust systematically over decades for his own gain. With that resolution clear in my mind, I finally fell asleep, prepared to face whatever Friday would bring. Friday morning arrived with the crisp clarity that often follows difficult decisions made in darkness. I woke at 6, earlier than necessary but unable to remain in bed once consciousness returned. My mind was already cataloging the tasks that needed to be accomplished, the questions that required answers, and the evidence that needed to be gathered and organized. I made coffee and sat down at my dining room table with my laptop, prepared to spend the day conducting a systematic investigation into exactly what had been done using my identity, and how such an elaborate fraud had been constructed. The first priority was understanding the full scope of the financial fraud. Detective Morrison had mentioned that the $500,000 originated from a Cayman Islands account, but I needed to understand the complete chain of transactions and documentation that made this fraud appear legitimate to the various parties involved. I began by carefully reviewing every document that Uncle James had sent me on Tuesday evening, this time not with shock and confusion but with analytical focus, looking for specific details that might provide investigative leads. The loan agreement document contained a footer indicating it had been prepared by someone called Velocity Capital Partners, supposedly a business lending firm. I searched for this company name online and found a professional-looking website describing a firm that specialized in private lending for real estate investments and business ventures. The website included photographs of a modern office, testimonials from supposedly satisfied clients, and detailed descriptions of various lending products and services. However, when I looked more carefully at the website details, I noticed several concerning elements. The domain name had been registered only 8 months ago, according to the registration records. The office photographs appeared to be stock images that I could find on multiple other websites when I ran them through a reverse image search. The physical address listed for the company was the same virtual office service that Detective Morrison had identified as the supposed location of Richard Voss's law practice. This discovery indicated that Velocity Capital Partners was likely a completely fabricated entity created specifically to add legitimacy to fraudulent lending operations. Someone had invested time and resources into building a convincing corporate facade complete with professional website, fake testimonials, and rented virtual office space. This level of sophistication suggested that whoever had orchestrated this fraud had done it before and likely had multiple victims beyond just me. I documented everything I found about Velocity Capital Partners, taking screenshots of the website, noting the domain registration details, and compiling a list of every piece of information that might help investigators track down who had actually created this fake company. I sent all of this documentation to both Detective Morrison and Patricia Hendricks with detailed notes explaining what I had discovered and what it suggested about the nature of the fraud operation. Next, I turned my attention to the bank statements that Uncle James had been shown, the fabricated documents that supposedly demonstrated I had over $600,000 in liquid assets. These statements appeared to be from my actual bank, complete with correct logos, formatting, and account numbers. However, the balances and transaction histories were completely false. I called my bank's fraud department and spoke with the supervisor, explaining that someone had created counterfeit bank statements in my name that showed balances I did not actually have. The supervisor was extremely concerned and told me that creating false bank statements was a serious crime that the bank took very seriously, as it could expose the bank itself to liability if those statements were used to obtain credit or facilitate other fraudulent transactions. The bank launched its own internal investigation to determine whether anyone with authorized access to their systems had been involved in creating the false statements, or whether they had been fabricated entirely externally using information obtained through other means. The supervisor told me that they would be checking for any unauthorized access to my accounts, any unusual inquiries about my account information, and any internal records that might indicate how someone obtained the detailed information necessary to create convincing forgeries of their documents. I spent considerable time that morning reconstructing the timeline of how my personal information might have been compromised. Identity theft of this sophistication required access to extensive personal details including my full legal name, date of birth, social security number, bank account numbers, address history, and employment information. I created a comprehensive list of every organization that had this information on file, ranging from my employer to financial institutions to healthcare providers to government agencies. I then began the tedious process of contacting each organization to inquire about any data breaches, unauthorized access to my files, or suspicious inquiries about my information. Most organizations assured me that they had not experienced any known data breaches, and that my information appeared secure in their systems. However, one conversation provided a significant clue. When I spoke with the Human Resources Department at my employer, the representative checked my file and mentioned that about 4 months ago, someone identifying themselves as my attorney had called requesting verification of my employment and salary information. The person had provided my social security number and other identifying details, and the HR representative had confirmed my employment status, job title, and salary range as was standard practice for such verification requests. The HR representative had noted the call in my file, including the name and phone number of the supposed attorney who had called. I felt a chill as I wrote down this information. The supposed attorney's name was Richard Voss. Someone using the same name that appeared on the fraudulent loan documents had called my employer 4 months ago to verify my employment and income, obtaining information that was then presumably used to make the fraud more convincing. This was not a random identity thief making opportunistic use of stolen data. This was someone who had been planning this fraud for months, systematically gathering information, and building a false financial profile under my name. I immediately shared this discovery with Detective Morrison, who confirmed that this was a significant development in the investigation. The phone number that the fake Richard Voss had provided to my employer could be traced, and the timing of that inquiry 4 months ago established when the fraud planning had begun. This also suggested that whoever had orchestrated this fraud had some knowledge of standard verification processes and professional protocols, making it more likely that an actual attorney or someone with legal industry experience was involved. By Friday afternoon, I had compiled a substantial dossier of evidence and documentation. I had created detailed timelines showing when various aspects of the fraud appeared to have occurred. I had documented the fake company website and corporate entities involved. I had identified the specific point at which my employment information was fraudulently obtained. I had screenshots, notes, contact information, and organized records of every relevant detail I had been able to discover. But there was one critical piece of information I still needed to obtain, and getting it would require me to take a step I had been avoiding. I needed to talk to Uncle James directly, not to argue or accuse, but to gather information about exactly how he had been approached about this supposed loan and what details he could provide about his interactions with the people involved in setting it up. As much as I believed he was likely a willing participant in the fraud, there was also a possibility that he had been deceived by sophisticated con artists who had used my identity as part of a larger scheme to steal money that would ultimately disappear, leaving Uncle James facing legal consequences for a property purchase based on fraudulent financing. I called Uncle James Friday evening, after I had finished compiling all my research and documentation. He answered on the second ring, his voice wary. "Maya, I was hoping you would call. We need to talk about this situation and clear up the confusion. I am calling because I need information from you," I said, keeping my voice neutral and factual. "I need to understand exactly how this supposed loan was arranged, who approached you about it, and what documentation you received throughout the process. I am not calling to argue about whether the loan is real. I know with absolute certainty that I never authorized any loan, that the signatures on those documents are forgeries, and that my bank statements were fabricated. What I need to know now is how this fraud was presented to you and who was involved in creating it." There was a long silence. When Uncle James spoke again, his tone was more defensive. "Maya, I understand you are upset, but accusing me of fraud is going too far. I had no idea there was anything wrong with the documentation. Everything looked completely legitimate. Richard Voss is an attorney I have worked with before. He has helped me structure several deals over the years. When he told me you had approached him about wanting to invest in one of my projects, I had no reason to doubt him." "You said you have worked with Richard Voss on several previous deals," I said, focusing on this specific detail. "Tell me about those deals. When did you first meet him? How did you find him? What other transactions has he helped you with?" Uncle James seemed to hesitate, as though recognizing that he was being led into providing information that might not support his version of events. "I met Richard about 3 years ago through a business networking group. He specializes in private lending and real estate transactions. He helped me structure the financing for a commercial property purchase, and he connected me with several private lenders who were interested in investing in my projects. What is the name of this networking group? I asked, writing notes as he spoke. It was called Colorado Real Estate Investment Network. They held monthly meetings at a hotel conference room in Boulder. I made a note to research this organization. And the commercial property purchase that Voss helped you with 3 years ago, did that transaction complete successfully? Another hesitation. The deal fell through at the last minute. The property inspection revealed some issues and the seller would not negotiate on price, so I decided not to proceed. Did you lose any money in that failed transaction? I lost the earnest money deposit, about $10,000, but that is standard risk in real estate investing. I noted this as well. A pattern was beginning to emerge. And the private lenders that Voss connected you with, did any of those lending relationships result in you actually receiving funding for your projects? A longer silence this time. Some of those deals were in various stages of negotiation but had not closed yet before this current resort development opportunity came up. Translation. None of those supposed lending relationships had actually produced any money, but Uncle James had been strung along with promises of future funding while paying fees, deposits, or other costs that enriched the people running the scheme. This was looking less like Uncle James being an innocent victim of sophisticated fraud, and more like him being a willing participant in what he knew or should have known was a fraudulent operation. Uncle James, I need you to be completely honest with me right now, I said, allowing some of the steel in my voice to show. Did Richard Voss ever suggest to you that he could arrange financing that appeared to come from family members or other private individuals, even if those individuals had not actually agreed to provide the money? Did he ever talk about creating documentation that would satisfy sellers or closing agents without the supposed lenders actually needing to transfer real money until after a property purchase closed? The silence that followed this question was damning. It stretched for 10, 15, 20 seconds. When Uncle James finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. He said something once about creative financing structures that allowed deals to close even when traditional funding was not available. He said that in some cases, documentation could be prepared that satisfied closing requirements, and then the actual funding could be arranged afterward once the property was secured. He said it was a common practice in high-level real estate investing. There it was. Uncle James had known, or at minimum strongly suspected, that the loan documentation was not entirely legitimate. He had been told that creative financing structures and documentation that satisfied closing requirements without real money actually changing hands was somehow acceptable. He had chosen to proceed with this arrangement despite the obvious red flags because he wanted the property deal to happen, and was willing to overlook questionable practices to make it occur. Uncle James, what you just described is fraud, I said flatly. Creating false documentation to satisfy closing requirements when the funding does not actually exist is not creative financing. It is criminal fraud. If you participated in such a scheme knowingly, you are legally liable regardless of whether you personally forged any documents. I did not know your signature was forged, he said quickly, defensively. Richard showed me documents that appeared to have your signature. He told me you had signed everything and that you were excited about the investment opportunity. I believed him because he had official paperwork and everything looked proper. But you never called me directly to confirm any of this, I pointed out. You never had a single conversation with me about this supposed $500,000 loan before the money allegedly appeared in your project account. You received documents supposedly signed by me for the largest financial transaction we had ever had, and you did not think to pick up the phone and talk to me about it directly. Why not? Another damning silence. The answer was obvious even without him saying it. Uncle James had not called me to confirm because at some level he had known that if he asked me directly, I would tell him I had not agreed to any such loan. He had chosen to accept Richard Voss's documentation without verification because that allowed him to proceed with the property purchase while maintaining some degree of plausible deniability about whether the financing was legitimate. I need you to send me every piece of communication you have ever had with Richard Voss, I said. Every email, every text message, every document he has ever provided to you for any transaction. I need the contact information for everyone else you met through this Colorado real estate investment network. I need the names of any other private lenders Voss claimed to connect you with. I need every single detail about your entire relationship with him and everything you know about how he operates. You can send it to me voluntarily right now, or Detective Morrison will subpoena it as part of the criminal investigation into the identity theft and fraud that has been committed using my name. Either way, law enforcement is going to see all of it. Your choice is whether you cooperate now or whether you wait to be compelled. Maya, please, you have to understand my position here. If this deal falls through because of these accusations, I am going to lose a significant amount of money. The earnest money deposit alone was $50,000. The seller is expecting this transaction to close on Monday. If I back out now, I lose everything I have invested in this project. I felt a surge of anger that I struggled to control. You are concerned about losing $50,000 when someone has committed $500,000 worth of fraud using my identity? You want me to allow a fraudulent property transaction to proceed, so that you do not lose your deposit? That is not going to happen. This transaction is not closing on Monday, because it is based on forged documents and stolen identity. The property sale is going to be blocked, and there is going to be a criminal investigation, and you are going to provide investigators with every piece of information they need to understand how this fraud was perpetrated. Those are the only things that are definitely going to happen. What is not yet determined is whether you are going to be charged as a co-conspirator, or whether you are going to cooperate with the investigation and potentially be treated as another victim who was manipulated by a sophisticated fraud operation. Are you threatening me? Uncle James asked, and there was anger in his voice now mixed with something that might have been fear. I am explaining your legal situation to you, I said coldly. I have spent 2 days investigating what was done using my identity. I have documentation showing that someone using the name Richard Voss called my employer 4 months ago to fraudulently verify my employment information. I have evidence that the company supposedly providing the loan does not actually exist beyond a fake website and virtual office address. I have bank records proving that the statements you were shown are complete fabrications. I have traced the supposed $500,000 back to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands that has nothing to do with me. This is a sophisticated, premeditated fraud operation, and every piece of evidence I have found is now in the hands of law enforcement and my attorney. You can cooperate and provide information about your involvement, or you can try to maintain this fiction that you knew nothing about anything being wrong, but either way the truth is going to come out. Uncle James was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different, harder and more calculating. You are making a serious mistake, Maya. You are going to destroy our family over a business deal that went wrong. You are going to create conflict and pain that will never be repaired. Is that really what you want? Is proving you are right about some paperwork worth losing your entire extended family? This was the manipulation I had been expecting, the appeal to family loyalty and the threat of social consequences if I refused to drop the matter. A week ago, this approach might have been effective. The Maya who existed before Tuesday evening might have been vulnerable to suggestions that she was being unreasonable or causing unnecessary family drama. But I was not that person anymore. What I want is for people who commit fraud to face appropriate consequences, I said steadily. What I want is for my identity not to be stolen and used for criminal purposes. What I want is for the pattern of you exploiting family members financially to finally end. If you are concerned about family conflict, you should have thought about that before you participated in a scheme to steal my identity for a fraudulent property purchase. The conflict was created by your actions, not by my response to those actions. I am done with this conversation. Send me the information I requested, or deal with Detective Morrison directly. Those are your options. I ended the call before he could respond. My hands were shaking slightly from the adrenaline of the confrontation, but I also felt a sense of clarity and strength. I had not been manipulated. I had not backed down. I had obtained useful information about Uncle James's relationship with the fake attorney, and about how much he had known regarding the questionable nature of the financing arrangement. That information would be valuable for the investigation. I immediately sent Detective Morrison a detailed summary of my conversation with Uncle James, including the admission that Richard Voss had discussed creative financing structures that involved documentation without actual funding, the revelation that Uncle James had stood to lose a $50,000 deposit if the deal did not close, and the fact that Uncle James had never directly verified with me that I had agreed to provide the loan despite the extraordinary amount involved. I also provided the name of the Colorado real estate investment network that Uncle James claimed to have met Voss through, suggesting that this organization might be worth investigating as a potential source of fraud victims, or as a front for recruiting people into fraudulent schemes. Patricia Hendricks called me within an hour of receiving my summary. Maya, this conversation with your uncle provided extremely valuable information. His admission that he was told about financing structures that involve documentation without actual funding is going to be very difficult for him to walk back if he claims he had no knowledge that anything improper was happening. The fact that he had significant money at stake that would be lost if the deal fell through gives him clear motive to proceed, even if he suspected the documentation might not be entirely legitimate. And his failure to verify directly with you about a $500,000 loan is going to be viewed very skeptically by any reasonable person. She paused, and I could hear papers rustling. I have filed the emergency motion to block Monday's property closing. The hearing is scheduled for Monday morning at 9. I will be arguing that the transaction is based on fraudulent documentation and stolen identity, and I will be requesting that the court issue a temporary restraining order preventing the sale from proceeding until the fraud investigation is complete. Based on the evidence we have compiled, I am confident the judge will grant the restraining order. What happens to Uncle James's $50,000 deposit if the sale is blocked? I asked. That depends on the specific terms of the purchase contract, and on whether the seller chooses to pursue keeping the deposit or releasing it given the circumstances. However, that is not your concern or responsibility. Your uncle made the decision to enter into a contract based on financing he knew or should have known was questionable. If he loses his deposit as a consequence of that decision, those are consequences he brought upon himself through his own choices. We discussed additional aspects of the legal strategy and the ongoing criminal investigation. Patricia told me that federal investigators were now involved given the interstate wire fraud, money laundering, and the use of offshore accounts. The FBI would be taking over certain aspects of the investigation from local law enforcement, though Detective Morrison would continue to be involved as well. The sophistication and scope of the fraud had elevated it beyond a local identity theft case into something much more serious. After ending the call with Patricia, I spent the remainder of Friday evening organizing all the evidence and documentation I had compiled over the past 3 days into a comprehensive master file. I created detailed timelines, summaries of key facts, annotated copies of important documents, and a narrative explanation that walked through exactly what had happened and what I had discovered through my investigation. This master file would serve as the central reference document for all the various legal and law enforcement proceedings that were going to occur. As I worked, I found myself reflecting on how much I had learned about investigation, documentation, and legal processes over the past 3 days. Prior to Tuesday evening, I had never dealt with identity theft, criminal fraud, or legal proceedings more complex than reviewing a standard employment contract or apartment lease. Now I was coordinating with multiple attorneys, law enforcement agencies at various levels, and financial institutions. I was learning about wire fraud statutes, identity theft laws, money laundering regulations, and criminal procedure. I was developing skills in evidence gathering, timeline creation, and systematic investigation. These were not skills I had ever wanted or expected to need, but I was discovering that I was reasonably good at applying my analytical training and professional experience to this crisis. The same methodical, detail-oriented approach that made me effective at analyzing healthcare data was serving me well in investigating financial fraud. The same ability to identify patterns and anomalies that I use professionally was helping me spot inconsistencies and red flags in the fraudulent documents. The same communication skills I had developed for presenting complex findings to non-technical audiences were proving valuable in explaining the fraud to attorneys and law enforcement officers. I was also discovering resources of determination and resilience that I had not fully appreciated I possessed. Many people in my situation might have been paralyzed by shock, might have struggled to function while dealing with such a violation and betrayal. I had certainly experienced shock and emotional trauma, but I had been able to channel those feelings into productive action relatively quickly. I had assembled help, gathered evidence, and begun fighting back against what had been done to me within hours of discovering the fraud. That ability to move from victim to agent, from passive recipient of harm to active pursuer of justice, was something I was beginning to recognize as a fundamental strength of character. Saturday morning brought new developments. Detective Morrison called to tell me that investigators had made contact with the real Richard Voss, the intellectual property attorney whose name had apparently been stolen by the fraudster. The real Richard Voss had been completely unaware that his identity was being used for fraudulent lending schemes. He had filed his own identity theft report and was cooperating with investigators. However, he had also provided some useful information. About 6 months ago, someone had called his office claiming to be a potential client interested in trademark protection services. During that call, the person had asked detailed questions about Richard Voss's background, areas of practice, and professional history, supposedly to determine if he would be a good fit for their needs. The caller had never followed up to actually retain him as an attorney, but the call had given someone the information they needed to impersonate him convincingly. This revelation added another layer to the fraud scheme. The perpetrators had not randomly chosen a name to use. They had specifically identified a real attorney, researched his background, and stolen his professional identity to add credibility to their fraudulent operations. This suggested a level of planning and sophistication that went well beyond opportunistic crime. Detective Morrison also told me that investigators had found evidence that the Colorado real estate investment network that Uncle James mentioned was likely a front organization used to identify and recruit potential fraud participants or victims. The organization had operated for approximately 3 years, holding monthly meetings that attracted people interested in real estate investing. At these meetings, attendees would hear presentations about investment opportunities, creative financing strategies, and networking with private lenders. The meetings appeared legitimate on the surface, but investigators believed they were actually being used to identify people who were financially stressed, overly optimistic about investment opportunities, or willing to bend rules to make deals happen. Several other people who had attended these networking meetings had filed complaints with law enforcement about suspicious lending arrangements, deals that fell through after they paid substantial deposits or fees, or promises of financing that never materialized. The pattern suggested that the networking group was a sophisticated operation for identifying marks and drawing them into various schemes that extracted money while delivering little or nothing of value. Uncle James had apparently been involved with this organization for 3 years, attending meetings regularly and pursuing multiple deals connected with people he met there. This timeline aligned with the period after his bankruptcy, when he would have been struggling to find legitimate financing for new business ventures, and might have been particularly vulnerable to anyone offering alternative funding options. It also suggested that his involvement with fraudulent operations might extend beyond just the current situation with my stolen identity. I spent much of Saturday documenting these new revelations and updating my master evidence file. I also began the process of reaching out to other members of my extended family to inform them about what had happened, before they heard distorted versions from Uncle James or others. I called my 2 aunts on the East Coast, my father's sisters whom I saw rarely but who I knew should be informed about what their brother had been involved in. Both conversations were difficult but necessary. I explained factually what had occurred, how my identity had been stolen, how Uncle James had proceeded with a fraudulent property purchase, and what I had discovered about his involvement with questionable business operations over an extended period. I sent them copies of key documentation so they could see the evidence for themselves. Both aunts were shocked and disturbed, though their reactions differed somewhat. Aunt Linda, the older of the two, was primarily concerned about the family implications and worried about how this would affect family gatherings and relationships. Aunt Susan, who was a physician and more analytically minded, wanted to understand exactly how the fraud had been perpetrated and whether Uncle James had been a perpetrator or a victim. I told them both honestly that based on everything I had discovered, I believed Uncle James had at minimum been willfully blind to obvious signs that something was wrong with the financing arrangement, and quite possibly had been an active participant in a scheme he knew or should have known was fraudulent. I acknowledged that there was still investigation ongoing, and that final conclusions would need to wait for law enforcement to complete their work. But I also made clear that regardless of the investigation's outcome, I would not be dropping the matter, would not be maintaining silence to preserve family harmony, and would not be allowing concerns about family conflict to prevent me from pursuing appropriate accountability. Aunt Linda responded with what I recognized as a version of the same appeal to family loyalty that Uncle James had made. She suggested that perhaps there were ways to resolve this privately without involving law enforcement, that criminal prosecution would be devastating to Uncle James and to the entire family, and that surely we could find some solution that did not require destroying family relationships. I told her gently but firmly that private resolution was not possible when sophisticated criminal fraud involving $500,000 in international money laundering had occurred, that my concern was ensuring justice was served and preventing future victims rather than protecting Uncle James from consequences he had brought upon himself, and that any damage to family relationships had been caused by Uncle James's actions rather than by my response to those actions. Aunt Susan was more supportive, acknowledging that if the facts were as I had described them, then serious accountability was necessary regardless of family considerations. She told me something that I had not known previously. About 10 years ago, Uncle James had approached her requesting a loan of $30,000 for a business venture, claiming it was a short-term need, and that he would repay her within 6 months. She had declined, not because she did not have the money but because she had concerns about his business judgment and track record. Uncle James had been angry about her refusal, and had made comments to other family members suggesting she was being selfish and unsupportive. Hearing this, Aunt Susan recognized that her instinct to maintain boundaries had been correct, and she expressed concern about how many other family members might have been victimized over the years, but had not spoken up about it. By Saturday evening, I had accomplished everything I could in terms of investigation and documentation. The legal motion to block Monday's property closing had been filed. Law enforcement at multiple levels was investigating the fraud. I had informed key family members about the situation. I had compiled comprehensive evidence and created detailed records of everything I had discovered. Now I had to wait for Monday's hearing and for the various investigations to proceed through their necessary steps. I allowed myself to rest on Sunday, recognizing that I had been operating in crisis mode for 5 straight days and needed some recovery time before the court hearing on Monday. I did yoga, took a long walk, read a novel that had nothing to do with fraud or legal proceedings, and tried to give my mind a break from the constant stress and vigilance of the past week. I prepared myself mentally for whatever Monday might bring, knowing that the court hearing would be a significant moment in this process, but that it was likely just the beginning of a long journey toward full resolution and accountability. Monday morning arrived with the weight of consequence. I woke at 5:30, unable to sleep any longer despite having gone to bed at a reasonable hour the night before. The court hearing was scheduled for 9 o'clock, and I needed to be prepared both practically and emotionally for what was likely to be a pivotal moment in this entire ordeal. I dressed carefully in professional attire, a navy suit that I typically reserved for important presentations at work. I wanted to project competence and credibility, to appear as someone whose testimony and claims should be taken seriously by the court. Patricia Hendricks had told me that my presence at the hearing was not strictly required since she would be presenting the legal arguments on my behalf, but I had insisted on attending. This was my identity that had been stolen, my life that had been violated, and I wanted to be present when the legal system began the process of providing protection and accountability. I also wanted to see Uncle James face to face in a formal legal setting where his usual charm and manipulation tactics would be less effective. I arrived at the courthouse 45 minutes early, passing through security and finding my way to the correct courtroom. Patricia was already there, reviewing documents at one of the counsel tables. She looked up as I approached and gave me a brief, professional smile. We sat together and she walked me through what to expect during the hearing. She would present the motion to block the property sale, providing the court with evidence of identity theft and fraudulent documentation. The opposing party, which would be the seller of the property and their attorney, would have an opportunity to respond. Uncle James and his attorney might also be present and might offer their own arguments. The judge would review the evidence presented and make a determination about whether to issue the temporary restraining order, preventing the sale from proceeding as scheduled. Around 8:45, Uncle James arrived with an attorney I did not recognize. Uncle James looked diminished somehow, his usual confident bearing replaced with something that resembled nervousness or perhaps anger being held tightly in check. He did not look in my direction or acknowledge my presence. His attorney, a man in his 60s with silver hair and an expensive suit, immediately approached Patricia to discuss the matter. I could not hear their conversation, but I observed their body language and facial expressions. Patricia remained calm and professional, presenting information in a measured way. Uncle James's attorney appeared increasingly troubled as the conversation continued, shaking his head and asking what appeared to be pointed questions. At precisely 9 o'clock, the judge entered and the hearing began. The judge was a woman in her 50s with a no-nonsense demeanor, who appeared to have already reviewed the filings and supporting documentation. Patricia presented the motion efficiently, explaining that her client, myself, had been the victim of identity theft, and that fraudulent documents had been created showing a loan that had never been authorized. She provided the court with copies of the forged signature comparisons, the fabricated bank statements, the evidence that the supposed lending company was fictitious, and the documentation showing that a fraud investigation was underway with both local and federal law enforcement. The attorney representing the property seller stood to respond. He argued that his client was an innocent party who had entered into a legitimate purchase agreement in good faith, that the seller had taken the property off the market based on the expected closing, and that blocking the sale at this late stage would cause significant harm to the seller without clear justification. However, his arguments were notably weak regarding the actual question of whether the financing was fraudulent. He did not contest the evidence of forged documents or false bank statements. He primarily argued that even if there were problems with the buyer's financing, that should not prevent the sale from proceeding if alternative legitimate financing could be arranged. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.